So when you apply textures to an object, you can also specifically decide how to map those textures. And this technique is called UV mapping, and it works with polygonal objects. We're going to go ahead and select our modeling submenu, and with it you'll be able to see that there is a UV menu here. And so this is what we'll be using mostly in this tutorial to learn about UV mapping textures. Before we do this, let's create a new material. So go to your hypershade and let's create an Arnold standard surface shader. So under Arnold shader, you can find the AI standard surface. And maybe let's rename this material so that we can easily find it. And let's call it UV map test. Now we're going to select the checkered grid next to color. And this will open up the render node window. And in the render node window, I want you to select the grid node. With the grid selected, you'll see here that we have these basic settings. We're basically creating a black and white grid, and we'll leave everything as is for now, and we're going to select our table, and we're going to assign this UV map test material to the table. So with it assigned, you'll see now how the texture has been applied to the table, and we may want to be more specific about the way we want this grid to look on our table. So there's different mapping modes that we can use. So if you go to UV, you'll see here you have automatic. So with your table selected, click on automatic. So automatic assigns planes for each direction in X, Y, and Z, and you can scale it and move it around to match those planes. So for example, if I click and drag this box, I'm scaling everything in my Z plane, or I can scale up in my Y plane. And once you have selected the UV automatic mode, you see now that we're not in our object mode, we're actually in a sub-menu that is this UV editing function. If you want to go back to object mode, you have to right click and select object mode. So if I right click again, you see we have this UV mode that we were in previously in order to assign the automatic UV mapping onto our object. Let's go ahead and look at another. We have cylindrical, and so cylindrical creates a cylindrical map around the object, and it's almost like adding a label around an object. So it works very well with things that have more of a cylindrical shape, such as a water bottle label, for example. Something important to note is that you can always access these handles by using the attribute editor too. So if moving things around in the viewport are not so comfortable for you, you can also go to the attribute editor, and once you assign a texture, a UV map to a texture, it automatically creates a new tab. So you can see here the polycylindrical project tab, which basically does the same as working in the viewport with these handles. So if you're more comfortable moving these values with these sliders and having more precision over the rotation or where the projection is located, you can use the attribute editor in any of these UV mapping techniques. If we go to planar, UV planar, this is also a very useful mapping mode for flatter objects such as a surface. But what planar does, it creates a plane, and again, you can scale and move that plane to match whatever side you want. So again, here under our attributes, we can scale this up and down, and we can rotate our plane around, and we can also move it. So if you see here, when I move this, these values are also changing. Again, to enter or exit UV mode, just right click over your object and select object mode again, and you should be able to leave the UV editing mode and go back to your object mode to select your table. So we've done a bunch of different UV mapping modes, and we have all of these tabs that we're not using. So I'm going to go to Edit, Delete by Type, and History. And if you go back to your attribute editor, you see that now we have lost all of these different UV mapping modes, properties that we assigned to this table, and we now have just the simple shape nodes, as well as the material node. So now that we've looked at these more standard or simpler mapping techniques that are kind of default pre-programmed techniques in Maya, I want to show you how to work by mapping face by face or on a region by region faces by using the UV editor. So to open up the UV editor, you can either access it by, again, clicking on UV and UV editor. And this window pops up, the UV editor window, as well as this UV toolkit, which can be very useful when assigning UVs. Another way to access this window is if you go to Windows, Modeling Editors, and UV Editor. So I'm going to make this window a little bit smaller so that you can see both my viewport and my UV editor window. And now I'm going to go again back to assigning an automatic UV. And you can see here how Maya has unfolded kind of the geometry of my table. And so with the UV editor, this really allows you to understand the way that the image is being mapped onto the geometry. And another really useful thing is that you can actually edit all of the components of the table so that they're correctly mapped, or they're just mapped exactly the way you want them to be. So for example, say I wanted my tabletop to actually be right at this center so that I get these 4 squares right on the top. First, we would need to find which one of these surfaces is actually the top of my table. And to do that, you can select each element here, and it'll highlight on the UV editor, but it'll also highlight on the viewport. There's 2 ways of selecting UVs. It can be either with UV shell or UV. A UV shell selects an entire element that has already been kind of separated by my automatic projection mode. So let's go under UV shell, and let's select the top of our table. And since we wanted to actually be able to map these 4 squares, we need to scale this up. So if we scale this up, we're not actually scaling our geometry, we're just scaling the way the image is mapped onto our geometry. So it's kind of a similar but inverse logic of 3D modeling. So I've scaled this up, and you can see now that my tabletop is covering the 4 squares that I wanted to have, right? And We can do the same with each element. So we can also, for example, decide how we want the legs to be mapped. Maybe we just want to have them be completely black and have none of the white grid. So we can scale these down, right? And then they'll specifically only be under a black area. So UV editing can get really complex, especially with more organic forms, right? And it requires a lot of practice and patience to understand its logic properly. But I want you to see how you can start to kind of assign specific UV coordinates and have more control over the way your texture is mapped. So you can also, for example, have overlapping UVs. So if I'm using this square for the top of my table and I want the bottom of my table to have the same UV coordinates, I can just place it in the same location. And you'll see that it has the same grid now. So try adding a texture to your table and have it have a specific UV coordinate system assigned to the texture. Again, remember, if you want to exit UV mode, you have to right-click and go back to object mode. And if you ever want to edit the UVs of a texture, you can just go back to your UV editor. And whatever object you select, if it does have UVs assigned, it'll show them here. And again, you can either assign by going to UV shell and select entire shells of components, or you can select UV, and with the UV toolkit you can see that you can actually select with vertex mode, edge mode lets you select an edge, or entire faces. And anything you highlight in your UV editor also highlights in your object, so you know what you're working with. Unless you specifically need to edit a face, I recommend you to work with UV shell.